Hi everyone, my name's Peter Field. I'm a principal designer at Media Molecule, and today I'll be speaking on level design and spatial communication within level design. And all I mean by that is the things that your level is communicating to the player as they play, and how we can understand that vocabulary and control that conversation to make sure that they get the intended experience, really. So, what I have for you today is quite an unusual talk, but hopefully it's a good way of communicating these ideas to people. So, I've presented a blockout. This is a blockout that I've built, and I'm going to play through it. I've got a microphone stuck to a DS4, so I'm going to play through this, and at certain junctures I'll pause and we'll talk about why I've laid it out in the way that I have, and hopefully break down some level design stuff. So the first thing that I want to touch on is actually why we build blockouts in the way that we do, because I think sometimes that reason can get a little bit lost. So for me, a blockout is maximum information for minimum effort. So I want to build as fast as I possibly can in a messy way, but always bearing in mind that I want to communicate certain design and gameplay information to the rest of the team. This is just basically a conversation piece that you'll use to build the level with the rest of your development team. So what I try to do is get to a playable state as soon as possible so that we can all sit down together and play it, because that always presents much more information than sort of theoretical design and talking about ideas as opposed to playing ideas. And it allows the rest of the team to creatively input much earlier as well. And it allows us to also be really, really flexible. So if you build in a really simple way, not putting too much detail into your levels, it means that you can be really agile and flexible. So other people can input ideas and we can accommodate those really quickly and be like, yes, and we can also like do all of these cool things for you. But also changes might come out of the blue from sources completely out of your control, and it can still allow you to be really helpful and accommodating for those changes. So that's just something to bear in mind. This is way neater, by the way, than I would usually build, because it's for a presentation and I don't want to present messy work. So the first thing that I want to talk about is presenting a clear goal and a clear objective for a player. So this is helpful for players, but it's initially something I developed because it's helpful for me as a designer to build things. So if when you open up a new scene and you've got this massive expanse of empty geometry that you feel you have to build the world to fill it, that can be quite intimidating. So it's called blank canvas syndrome. So what I do is I place down the player and I place down an objective in the distance. In this case, I placed down a cylinder, which became a lighthouse, and that was where I wanted to get to. And not every level will require you to get from A to B, but when it does, this is really useful. And now I don't feel like I have to build the whole world. I don't have to fill the entire space with geometry. I just have to fill in the gap between the player and the objective, and that makes it a more manageable exercise. And it also allows me to orchestrate my sightlines as I go. So here I'm presenting the player with an objective in the distance, and I've been able to compose this shot really specifically because I know where the goal is. And later in the talk I'll reiterate the goal many times, and each of those times it was only possible for me to orchestrate those compositions because I knew where the objective was. So that's a really helpful thing to have in your pocket when you're building a level as well. And it's also useful just to give the player a clear objective. If you imagine a player that knows exactly where they're going, they're going to make a much more direct route towards the goal than if they had no clue where they were going and they were just meandering about and feeling their way forward as opposed to thinking their way forward. So it can just make sure that the player is playing the game in the way that you intend if you are very open and clear about their objectives. Okay, so I'm going to try and head towards this this lighthouse, and I'm going to try and go through this door, but it's locked, so I'm going to try and look for another way through. I can see there's an opening above the door and some pipes that I can probably climb onto if I go up onto these filing cabinets and go across here. Okay, so as I drop down into this space, I can't see an exit because it's full of geometry. These big bits of machinery are blocking my sight. And that's actually what I want to talk about. So this point is motivating movement in the player. So the machinery is blocking the sight line, so I'm going to have to move around to see what is behind them and gather more information behind these bits of geometry. So I think the idea is that this is a much more engaging way of exploring and mentally mapping a space than if all the information was initially given to me. So as I get across to this side of the room, I can now see my exit from this vantage point up on this gantry, and so I've sort of I can start to piece together a map of this space by by viewing it from different perspectives. And you'll notice that there's no one spot in this room where I can see the entire room and just get like a good overview of it. I'm going to have to sort of jigsaw puzzle this space together in my mind as I explore. And just to sort of like hammer home that point of what the space would feel like if it presented too much information to the player right off the bat, we can remove the geometry, and you can see that entering a space like this is just not engaging in the slightest, because it gives the player all of the information right off the bat. You can see the exit, you can see all of its secrets, it's not hiding anything, there's no reason to move around and explore. So by blocking sight lines, you motivate the player to move around and gather information from different perspectives, and then the act of piecing those different pieces of information together is an engaging way of sort of mapping out a space. So that's kind of motivating movement through geometry in a nutshell. So this the second point that I want to make is tearing down walls, which is basically just trying to see the idea that we can block the player in creative ways which are much more visually interesting than if we just used walls. So here I want the player to cross this bridge, and I could well have just done this and put a solid wall on either side and the player would go across the bridge, but it's not very visually interesting. So I started to tear down the wall, and you'll notice that even though this is an open wall, it's a fatal drop down there. So the player is still blocked from escaping the level that way, but it creates functionally a similar space, but it's much more interesting. So and it's also allowed us to this is an opportunity that I took to reinforce our goal. So I could tear down the wall in such a way that it creates this nice composition where I can reiterate the player's goal for them. So as I make my way across the bridge, I'm going to try and use these doors. This door is locked, but there's a second door down here that's also locked. That's really frustrating. So these doors both look actionable from a distance, but as I approach them I find they're not actionable. So that's bad communication in terms of communicating ideas to the player, and I'm going to return to that point later. So hopefully just remember this spot. But right now the player is feeling quite frustrated, and they're going to have to probably backtrack across this bridge now because they've exhausted all of their exploration opportunities on this side of the bridge. And this is actually a deliberate thing that I was doing. Basically, I'm trying to reveal new information by approaching a space from a new perspective. So I forced them to go across the bridge, and then they found that it's a dead end and they're feeling quite frustrated, which is intentional because it allows us to sort of create these small pockets of tension which we can exploit and then release when they realize that when they sort of realize the path ahead was behind them. So what I've got here is, if I just pop my imp out, what I've tried to do is create these sort of barriers with the fallen debris and the blocks which push the player over to the left. There's a couple of leading lines leading over that way as well, but also you see the pipes from this perspective, whereas when we were coming at the bridge from the other angle they were blocked by these crates. So hopefully they didn't see it before. If they did, it doesn't really matter, but the intention was to create this small pocket of tension where the player is like almost at the point of throwing the controller through the window, but not quite that far, and then you release that tension and it becomes a much more engaging space. And hopefully these pipes are reading as something that the player can use, because if you remember earlier in the first room we used these pipes as a way of getting out of the space. So we've started to build this vocabulary of objects that the player can use in creative ways. So hopefully it's becoming a more engaging experience, and they're trying to think about how they get through a space as opposed to just sort of blindly and mindlessly like moving forwards. So we'll drop down into this space, and this is actually a one-way valve, so I can't get back up onto this pipe. And I want to talk about why and when we would use one-way valves to encourage the player to explore the space in the way that we want them to. So a one-way valve nudges the player forwards gently, basically by blocking off their escape route. So we can't go back and explore the earlier area now, so we have no choice but to explore the area ahead of us. And I've used it here because this next space that we're going to go into is quite a large open space, or at least larger than the previous areas we've been through, and I don't want them to get too lost or turned around. So if they do get turned around and they start going backwards, they can't go too far backwards because we've blocked their escape route. So it creates a more manageable space that the player can sort of digest in smaller chunks, I guess. But the other thing I want to talk about as we approach this space is presenting a privileged perspective as you look into a new space. So for example, this could be a combat space or a stealth space, and if it is one of those kind of spaces, if you were to enter on the ground floor and you have to sort of mentally map the space under the duress of combat or in a stealthy scenario, it can be quite intense, and it's really hard to take in spatial information when you're also juggling the act of like avoiding guards. So what this allows us to do is it allows the player to take stock of the space in a safe environment and form a plan before they dive into it. It also allows them to push forward at their own pace, so when they're ready and when they feel like they've got enough information, they can push forward. So it's just a nice way of making a more challenging space feel more manageable to the player. Yeah, so that's presenting a privileged perspective. And finally, as we look at this space, we can see there's lots of different routes that the player can go through. So this is kind of about making a space feel larger than it really is. So here we've got, we could go through this warehouse, or we could go through to this courtyard, or we could go up into this tunnel, and it looks like we can explore this building above the tunnel as well. There's lots of options open to the player, and the idea is that we've got lots of routes that converge on a single point later in the level. So although it's sprawling, the player doesn't have that much choice. We aren't building an unmanageable amount of space. We aren't making too much work for ourselves, and we aren't making the artists cry. We're just actually making 3 alternate routes through a single space, and the player is unlikely to take all of these routes. And if there's any single route that the player doesn't explore, it's going to make the space feel infinitely bigger than it actually is, because there's some unknown information out there that they haven't explored. So that's just sort of the illusion of choice and making a space feel larger than it really is. Okay, so because we've got lots of different routes, I want to talk about how we can sort of breadcrumb and draw the player through these spaces, because it becomes, there's so many more options to the player right now. So this is talking about attracting the player's attention. So up here we've got a sort of an officey space, or like a control room above this warehouse, and it's got some ceiling fans that are spinning, so the movement is going to catch the player's eye, but also the light on the ceiling fan is making the geometry easier to read. So it's not necessarily that the case that light will attract a player like a moth. It's just that a light will create high contrast between like the light and the dark spaces, so it's just much easier to read geometry in that way. And also the fan is going to create some noise, which is also going to attract the player. So I can see again that I could probably make my way into this control room from this gantry, and I can get up onto the gantry by this bus. No, it's not a bus, is it? It's a truck. Oh, I'm so nervous. Okay, so this is like a bonus point that I wanted to talk about, which is parallaxing environment. So up here we've got these support beams that create these really nice parallaxing bits of geometry as we move around. And the reason that's good, it's the same kind of thing as if you've got like thick atmosphere in your space, like a fog or something like that. The act of making a 3D space and then crushing it onto a 2D TV screen that the player has to read like throughout their gameplay experience, it takes away a lot of the information and the depth perception. So things like parallaxing and things like environmental mist and things like that, it provides depth cues to the player that help them read and judge distances and geometry. So and it also, for me, it just makes a much more dynamic image because the slightest touch of the control stick completely changes the image. So that's just a throwaway little tip, using parallaxing and layered geometry basically to help the player judge distances. I'm not going to go into the control room this way because I want to show some other tips from elsewhere in this part of the level. Okay, so this was a really big draw to me. I can see there's a tunnel here and I want to make my way up into the tunnel. The tunnel is blocked here. I shouldn't be surprised, I made the level. But what I want to talk about is this entrance here. So in this dark tunnel, this could be quite easy to spot, but I'm confident that the player will notice this because it's got a couple of really strong elements that will help the player read it. So this is talking about affordances and how they communicate function. So when we see a doorway, we don't just see the actual geometry that makes up the frame of the door. We see what a door means to us as humans. So like doorways and archways, they always afford moving through into a new space. So when we see that, we take that information as well as the geometry and we understand what it means. So I'm going to see this archway and I'm going to think that leads to a new space, but that's not where it ends. So we've also got like steps and they afford climbing. So these recognizable shapes all sort of reinforce and communicate ideas to players. In a computer game, a window also affords climbing through as much as a door does, whereas in real life it just affords looking through. But in computer games, we're basically cat burglars, or at least that's how I think of them. Think of players. And also you notice that the steps curve round, so I can't see where the steps go. So that's seeding ideas of it's creating mystery. I know it goes somewhere, but I don't know where. So that's quite exciting to me. So I'm confident that that would probably draw the player's attention, even if it's a small dark doorway in a dark tunnel. Okay, so now we're in the building that I could notice from I noticed earlier in the level, and this is actually the convergence point. So this is where a couple of these different routes sort of meet up, and they meet up on in this little corridor, looking at this door. So this is where I want to talk about creating mystery. So the door in front of me is slightly ajar and it's swaying in the breeze, so it's combining a lot of the elements that I talked about earlier. It's got a little bit of light coming in, bleeding in through the room behind the door, the sway of the door and the sway of the blinds are creating movement, which attracts my attention. But importantly for me, I can't see behind the door, but I know it's possible to open it, right? So the player knows there's something behind the door, but they don't know what it is, and this is creating like some curiosity in the player and mystery. And that's fundamentally like what we try to do in a lot of our level designs. We seed ideas, but we don't give the information to the player. So that is the fundamentals of creating mystery, is making sure the player assumes something exists, but they need to go and discover what that thing actually is. So I'll go through the door and I'm in this corridor, in this stairwell now, and as I climb the stairwell I can see I'm just gonna have a look through this door. So if I unblock this door and make my way up these steps, I realize that I'm back in the earlier space that I was in before. So this is talking about creating shortcuts and when they're really handy for a player for a designer to use this kind of tool. So previously we valved out of this space, so this space became inaccessible when we dropped into the courtyard. But by using a shortcut, I've actually allowed the player to access the earlier space. So that's really handy because one-way valves are an extremely useful tool for pushing the player forward and making spaces more manageable. But for me, it feels really annoying that I can't go back and explore the earlier space. So we can use shortcuts to sort of circumvent earlier areas of previous challenge. And it might not even be that I've valved through the space. It's just like, if I went through that first space and there was and it was a stealth space and it was really arduous to get through, and I don't necessarily want the player to have to confront that challenge multiple times, we can, once they've proven that they've completed that challenge, they can create a shortcut and circumvent it. And yeah, I think for me it just makes the space feel smaller and more accessible and more believable, because in life we don't really go through one-way valves and block our access off to earlier areas of spaces that we pass through. Okay, so as I come up these steps and out onto the balcony, I want to talk about pinch points. So we were previously in a really large, or it was a larger-ish area in the courtyard, and now we've narrowed the player's play space down more and more, and to the point where we are at a doorway which is really narrow. So this is the pinch point. This doorway is the pinch point, and the reason we use this is because I know where the player is at this specific moment in time, and therefore I know where the camera is by extension. So I can kind of control where the player is looking and where the player is, which means I can create these nice compositions like this re-establishment of the goal. We come out and I can frame this shot really nicely because I know where the player is, and I can show them some information that I want them to take in. So for here I want the player to get back on track and find their way to the lighthouse. So I do that by controlling their position, which means I can show them something without taking control away from the player. Anytime that I have to sort of take the camera away from the player and show them something specific, it sort of feels a little bit icky to me. I want the player to be in control as much as possible. So using a pinch point can be a really useful tool for presenting information to the player without taking control away from them. And here I want to talk about building a vocabulary with the player. So as soon as I got into this space, I saw these pipes, which I've used 2 times before to get to a new area, and I can see that the pipes bridge over to this new area, which definitely looks like it's leading up to the lighthouse. So so I've sort of seeded this idea in the player's mind of like, I could possibly use that to get to where I want to go. So by building this vocabulary, we're sort of seeding ideas in the player, and that's really nice because whether the player gets to go across this bridge or not, it's going to be beneficial. It's going to be a more engaging experience. So if we do go across the bridge, that is that's paying off an expectation which they previously had, which will be vindicating for them. But if we subvert that expectation and we go somewhere completely different, that's also quite engaging for the player because something unexpected is happening. But if we don't have that vocabulary to play with, they can't make assumptions which we can neither subvert or pay off. So it's just really important to sort of build a really strong language with the player that we can then start to exploit to have like a bit of a conversation with them. So that's what this pipe is doing. I'm seeding the idea that the player can use it to get across that gap, and they're sort of making their own plans in their head, which is really nice. This is a good example of, I haven't written anything up for this, but this is a diving board which is telling the player that they can jump across this gap, because we haven't really had any platforming in this level up until now. So if I try to jump across, that diving board is going to encourage me to do so. But if I fail, the thing I actually want to talk about is creating safety nets. So this could very well have been like a drop, and I would have fallen to my death and had to restart the section, and that's valid, but I think we can do better than that, and we have tools as designers to do better than that. So here I've created a safety net, so the player drops down into this space and they can make their way back up and retry the challenge. So for me, fundamentally, if you have to restart a section and get a game over screen and restart, that is fundamentally breaking the immersion of the game and the flow. So the more we can keep the player in the game as much as possible, that's beneficial to the player. And this is a solution that doesn't compromise or undermine the challenge. They still have to prove that they can complete this challenge, but it just keeps them in the flow state. So it's a bit of a softer blow as well. It's a bit of a softer way of telling them that they failed the challenge as well. I climb up onto these low roofs, and this, I think, so I'm kind of subverting expectations. I thought I was going to be able to make my way along here and go across the bridge, but I'm not able to, so that's an unexpected change. But this is, I think, more important because it's a good example again of communicating something to the player. So this is blocking my way, but you wouldn't put bars here unless you didn't want the player to go there, or like whoever built this space put bars here to stop people walking along this low rooftop. So that it's not only functionally blocking me, it's communicating to me that I should not go this way. So for example, if I sort of change the layout to have a gap here, this functionally does block me, but it's very bad communications because I've literally like moments earlier just jumped across this gap, and then if I see a larger gap, I feel like this is an escalation of challenge and I'm going to try and jump across it. And then if I try to jump across it and I fail because it's too large, I've actually I've got to retry a load of platforming again. So it's really misleading to sort of have a gap there instead of a blockage. So this is just sort of reinforcing the idea that everything in our levels communicates ideas to the player, and we have to be mindful of what this particular blockage is communicating to the player. Okay, so I'll climb into this building and try and find our way through this building. Here we unblock another shortcut back to this point, so hopefully this absolves me of the frustrating moment that I created earlier. So previously 2 unactionable doors that were frustrating me is now like this weird little nexus of shortcuts, or so the level is feeling much smaller and more interconnected now. But on the point of doors that look actionable from a distance, I just want to sort of talk about that really briefly. So this is an example of a door that isn't actionable and doesn't look actionable from a distance, so that's really good. So that's communicating to the player that you can't use it from a distance, and they won't walk all the way over, try it, get frustrated and walk back. And I think even better than, sometimes there's like lots of options that the player can use. If I go down the stairs, there's a door that has a barricade blocking it, just like loads of furniture piled up in front of it, so I can't even get close to the door. But I think like even better than that sometimes is just removing the door, because an unbelievable an unrealistic space can sometimes be less frustrating than a realistic space that frustrates the player. So I could possibly like remove this door and just block this entire corridor off, and no one would be the wiser, and it would be fine. As I come into this room, I want to talk about adding temp furniture to sort of flesh out a space. So so a space will always feel larger when it's empty. So I'll just show an example of that. If I remove all the geometry, this space feels really large, and this is kind of all that I'm required to do as a level designer. I've put enough space in here so that I can have to facilitate the gameplay that I want to add, but it's just to sort of be mindful that when artists get hold of the space, they're going to want to flesh it out with props and tables and bits of furniture and things, and it's going to change how the space fundamentally feels. The scale of the space is going to feel different. So the point that I wanted to make here was, if you add geometry to your space, sort of temp furniture to sort of judge and gut check how big the space will feel once it's been fleshed out with art, you will be able to make the space large enough to accommodate both the gameplay you want and the art that the other departments want. So it's just a way of making sure that your spaces aren't going to have to change scale later in production, because that can be a real pain in the butt. So we come out of this window and we've overcome that challenge, and then we can walk across this bridge, which is what we expected. So that's like a nice payoff to the player. And then we drop into this space, and we make our way up the hill to the lighthouse. So I have to be careful how I communicate this point, because I always get it wrong. So here I want to talk about problem solution ordering. So I think the best way to do that is to play through the puzzle first and then talk about it. So here I'm going to try and open this gate. There's a padlock blocking the gate, but in jostling the gate I've knocked over this this crate. So now my objective is to find a key for this padlock, and so I'm going to maybe explore my local area, which is this guardhouse here. I can't seem to get into this guardhouse from the door because someone has parked this lorry really badly, but I can climb up onto this crate that I knocked over and make my way up onto this low roof and climb in to the guardhouse. So now I can start exploring the guardhouse. It's not in here, nothing in here. And I'll make my way downstairs. The space gets smaller and more dense. Doesn't seem to be around here. So this is the door that was locked by the truck. Here are the keys. Okay, so I've got the keys now, and I can go back and I can unlock the padlock. So this worked because, so this isn't really a puzzle. This is deliberately the most condensed version of a puzzle. It's like, I need a key, I'll go find a key. But it's deliberately condensed so that we can sort of talk about puzzle setup and puzzle communication. So this works because I was forced to recognize that there was a problem before I went and found the solution. So I couldn't have gone into that building and found the key until I had interacted with the gate and which knocked over these crates. So that means that I have to recognize that there's a problem, and then I can go about finding a solution. So you can imagine if the player, for example, came up to this setup and I slightly change it, I remove the truck, say, and now I come into this space and I might approach the building first, and I might go into this building and I might explore and find a key, which doesn't mean anything to me. It doesn't feel like an elative moment where I've overcome a problem or found something I was looking for. It's just a meaningless key because I don't know what it does yet. And then I go over to the gate and I unlock the gate because I've got a key instantly. So it doesn't feel like a locked gate. It feels like an open gate. So that is just really confusing for the player. So by controlling the flow of information, you can ensure that they sort of understand that there's a problem before they find a solution, because the alternative can be really confusing and can completely undermine a puzzle. So that is problem solution ordering in a nutshell. I hope that worked. That's always a bit I get stuck on when I try to communicate it. So as I go up this hill, I'm getting much closer to my destination now. I can see the lighthouse. I feel like I'm really close. But to get there, it looks like I'm going to have to go through these woods, which is going to mean that I lose sight of my goal, which is a bit frustrating. And now I'm in these deep, dark woods and I'm a bit confused and lost. So this point is about letting the player get lost. Because if you imagine, if I just walked straight up to the lighthouse and the path was quite long, but I could continuously check in with the lighthouse and judge how far I had to walk to get to it, that doesn't create any tension. I constantly am reassured by how far I've come, and I can quantify how far I've come, and you don't create any tension. But by letting the player feel like they're close to their goal and then losing their goal and getting a bit turned around, it creates this tension in the player's journey, which then again gets paid off when they finally work out how to overcome this problem. So over here I can see this interesting building that is highlighted by some light beams coming through the trees, and as I go into it again, I'm pinching the player into this small space, which means I control their perspective, which means I can show them the lighthouse again, and that creates this satisfying release. So it's about sort of this nice playful ebb and flow of creating tension and then releasing tension, and it creates a much more engaging journey than just constantly having this flat line of reassurance that you are going the right way. And I think if I was building this level properly, I would make this space 10 minutes larger, or it takes the player 10 more minutes to get, and I'd let them get quite lost. But for the sake of this presentation, I've made a small space that kind of feels like a wood that you could get lost in. Okay, so we're finally at the lighthouse, and as I make my way up the hill, you get a nice overview of the whole level that you've traveled across to get here. And I've got one more point. I need to get up to the lighthouse to make it. So yeah, I'm climbing up to the lighthouse, and you'll notice that the lighthouse is built on a really sort of quite a steep hill, which is believable. A lighthouse would be built on the highest point on a coast that you could possibly manage, because that makes it more visible from further out to sea. But it nicely dovetails with the point I want to make, which is build on uneven terrain. So this is kind of the thing that I advocate for the most, because when you build a level, it can be really tempting to build. I think basically modern creation suites like Maya and things, they they encourage people to build on the grid, and I don't think that's necessarily good, because you build your buildings and then you build the geometry underneath them to sort of make it feel more believable. But that's not how buildings are built in real life, and it doesn't provide any interesting architectural constraints for the player to have to compromise by. So what I do is, I initially said I place down a start point, which is this building over here, and then I would build an end point. And then the very next thing I would do is build a whole array, I build a whole mess of uneven terrain in between the two. And I would try and stick to this constraint as much as possible, because it makes me build more interesting spaces. So for example, if I go into this building over here, I enter on the ground floor, and it's this kind of classroom space. I'll remove the text so we can see what's going on. And then I go downstairs into what I assume is a basement, but it's not. It's an underground storage, or it's like a storage area, but it opens out onto like the ground floor again, because the space is built into a hillside. And all of these spaces are built on an internal grid, but and I think that's fine. It's just that none of them are on the same grid as each other, because they're all built into the contours of the hillside, and that just provides a much more interesting, much more exciting visual space. You get much more elevation, and it's just much more interesting, I think, to build in this way. Yeah, so it encourages designers to build off the grid, which I think is a really good thing. You can see here that this space, it's just a normal living space, but there are a couple of different areas, and that sort of splits the space up really nicely, and it creates these nice little points of vantage points of higher elevation. It's just like subtle, but I think it really pushes designers to build in really nice ways. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our talk. We've made it all the way to the lighthouse, and the player can explore this lighthouse and find their next objective. But yeah, building on uneven terrain was the point I wanted to end on, so I will leave it there. Okay, so thank you very much for sitting through my talk. I hope you found it interesting. If you have any comments or ideas of how to make this talk better, please reach out. I'd love to hear your ideas. You can reach me on Twitter on Peter__field. That's a really good way of getting in touch with me. But yeah, thank you very much. Goodbye.